The colonel didn't answer. Instead, he took his own canteen off his belt and handed it to me. Then he turned to the men in his patrol. "Break out your canteens, men," he told them. "Water!" our young runner yelled. It was a magic word. Every man in our platoon came up and out from where he was dug in, and as each of them approached us, I looked at them and realized how sorry a sight we must have appeared to these outsiders. My men were wide-eyed, with haunted, zombie-like expressions on their faces. Our uniforms were dirty and tattered, our faces were long overdue for shaves, and our hair was in need of cutting. Some of us were feverish with malaria, most of us suffered from dysentery, and all of us were gaunt and thin from lack of food. Most of all, we were thirsty as hell. In every sense of the word, we were raggedy-arse Marines. That colonel didn't have much more to say to us, but at least we had water that morning, and to his credit, he took word back to command that we were in serious need of relief. Early the next morning, this buck sergeant received a long overdue and much welcome order to take half of the 1st platoon down off the ridge and to the longer river to bathe. The idea was for us to wash ourselves and the utilities on our backs, which were the only clothes we ever had during our stay on the canal. We were to shave our faces, and mainly to get the fly-attracting stink off our frames. About 8 of us were able to trek to the river that morning. We arrived at the shore of the longer river at a spot where a tall tree had fallen and extended halfway across to the opposite bank. That tree trunk was bleached white by sun and sand. Since we lacked soap, we would have to use some of that river sand to wash our bodies and our clothes. We grounded our weapons at the riverbank, undressed, and walked into that sweet, clean water to a point where we were about waist-deep. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the fallen tree, a short, older, thin-haired man was also bathing. He was alone. We were on one side of the fallen tree, and he was on the other, so none of us paid particular attention to him until Hard Rock Gherkin glanced towards him and piped up, "Geez, that guy's got a bar of soap." The rest of us didn't say anything, but that didn't stop Gherk. He called out, "Hey, Mac, where the hell did you ever get that soap?" Before the man had a chance to answer, Gherkin waded closer to him. "You mind letting me use a little of that soap?" The older guy appeared affable enough. He turned halfway around toward us, extended his arm with soap in hand, and said, "Here, help yourself." Gherkin took the soap without as much as a word of thanks and started lathering himself. From my short distance away from them, I recognized one small detail that had somehow eluded PFC. Lawrence E. Gherkin. The man who had turned toward us and decided to be generous with his bar of soap was none other than General A. Vandergrift. Now, while we scrubbed our clothes with river sand and washed our stinking bodies clean, I stopped what I was doing and made an effort to get Hard Rock's attention. It was clear that Gherk had no idea that the man he was talking to, the man whose soap he'd just taken, was our commanding general. Gherk remained blissfully unaware that I was trying to catch his attention. "Boy, what a hell of a way to fight a war," he remarked to the general. "No chow, almost no drinkable water, and not enough ammo to start a decent firefight." "Yes," the general replied. "It certainly isn't the best way to fight a war." Gherkin nodded, then said, "What outfit are you in, buddy?" "Headquarters," the general said, as though maybe he was one of the less important aides back at the CP. "Hey, Gherk," I called. "Come over here." Gherkin paid no attention to me. He scrutinized the general. "Geez, you headquarters guys must be getting all the chow and the best supplies. Us guys out on the line get what's left over." "It's not exactly like that," the general replied mildly. I eased my way toward them, bent on rescuing Hard Rock before he really stuck his foot in his mouth. "Well," Gherkin persisted, "you guys must be getting pretty good chow. You still have a little gut going for you, Mac." By now I was beside Hard Rock and glaring at him. The general observed us, quietly amused, from his side of the fallen tree, which gave me an opportunity to look at him and say in my most cheerful voice, "Good morning, General. How are you today?" "I'm fine," AA replied. "And how are you men today?" With that, Hard rock made a sudden splash and disappeared beneath the water's surface. The general was grinning. We exchanged a little more small talk until Girk suddenly bobbed to the surface, extended his hand, and gave the general what remained of his bar of soap. There wasn't much of it left. "Geez, I'm sorry, General," he said, "but if I'm going to beat my gums and complain to somebody about this war, I might as well start at the top." The general was laughing now. "You make a very good point, young man," he said. And so it went. Just another average day in the life of PFC. Lawrence E. Gherkin, the 1st Platoon's peerless barman. The single most important reason why we Marines stayed on that godforsaken island and not only survived but defeated the Japanese can be summed up by that old cliché, self-reliance. After the campaign ended and the Japanese had been kicked off the canal, specific descriptions of Marine Corps' self-reliance were printed in a little blue-covered booklet titled Fighting on Guadalcanal, published by the U.S. Army. I'm one among many guys who know something about how that booklet was put together. Late in November, the 5th Regiment was pulled out of combat and moved back to a relatively safe area between division headquarters and the beach. By now we knew that the Navy would soon take us off the island, and the main thing we had to do was wait for the ship that would pick us up. Our wait lasted about a week, at which time the transport ship USS President Jackson appeared offshore. The Jackson was our ticket out of there. While we were waiting, we were bivouacked in grass country, not far from the Lunga River. One morning, for a change, the regiment managed to give us a little decent food, and after breakfast, the first sergeant approached me, read off the names of several men from L Company, and told me to round them up. Chink McCallan and Red Byrne were on his list, along with one or two others, including me. Our order was to report to 1st Division headquarters, where several Army officers wanted to talk with us. We were told in advance that we'd be asked about the different techniques and tricks we'd developed, and which we'd found to be effective during our engagements with the Japanese. We made our way toward headquarters, and on the way I recognized a number of men joining us from various units throughout the 5th Regiment. A captain assembled us and introduced 5 Army colonels, all of them young hotshots, and all of them full-bird colonels. One colonel got the meeting started, and what follows is a close approximation of the talk he gave us. "Men," he said, "General Marshall sent us out here from Washington on a fact-finding mission. We've just been to New Guinea, and now we're here on Guadalcanal to learn more details about staying alive and defeating the enemy in jungle combat. On New Guinea, our main job was to try to learn what the Army's problem has been. Up to the present, we've supplied General MacArthur with just about everything he's asked for on that island, and his troops haven't accomplished a damned thing. Meanwhile, we haven't given you Marines here on Guadalcanal much of anything, and you guys have done wonders. We want to know how you did it, and how you managed to succeed with so little help. We want to know about any little thing you believe you learned while you were in combat. Our intention is to put this information together and use it as part of a training program that the Army is about to start at a base in Louisiana. What we're going to do this morning is talk to each of you individually. We'll ask questions, and all we ask of you is to recall as many details as you can. Tell us how you succeeded in the different situations that we'll be discussing." With those words, the 5 colonels each took a spot on the ground. They sat down in the grass and called on us individually. We told them what we knew, what we did, and how we managed to do it. I sat down with one of the colonels, had a pleasant conversation with him, and responded to his questions. One unintentionally humorous question was, which weapons and equipment could you have used? When you consider that we won our battle mainly with the Springfield 03, a relic from World War I, while MacArthur's troops had spanking new M1 .30 caliber semi-automatic rifles, you have to start wondering what we could have accomplished if we'd received just a small fraction of the arms and supplies we'd been begging for and never received. This isn't a complaint against the Springfield 03, which is a good rifle. It's just one instance among hundreds where the Army got the new equipment and the Marines got what was left over. Most of those leftovers weren't of the same high quality as the 03. Anyhow, we, the raggedy-ass 5th Marines, answered the U.S. Army's questions to the best of our ability, and as honestly as we knew how. When we were finished, we went back to our units. I'd nearly forgotten about that morning until 1945, when I was in the 5th Division and training for what turned out to be the Marines' landing on Iwo Jima. We had an army captain with us, and when I was introduced to him, he said, "Your name is familiar. Do I know you from somewhere?" "It could be," I said. "I don't recall." He seemed to think about it for a moment. "I know your name from somewhere," he said. I saw him again the next day. "I knew I'd run across your name somewhere," he told me. "Here it is." He held out a small book, the Blue Manual, also known as Fighting on Guadalcanal, and 2 copies of the Infantryman's Journal. The journal quoted a few things I'd said back on the canal, and the Blue Manual quoted every word that I recall speaking to the Army Colonel. It also quoted replies from the many other Marines who had been interviewed on the canal that morning in early December 1942, along with frequent remarks about our replies from Colonel Merritt Edson. Edson's remarks weren't critical of the things we had to say. In every case, he simply corroborated the information we'd given to the Army. The Army captain told me that these were the books he'd used back in Louisiana, when he'd trained troops in methods of jungle combat and survival. I hadn't seen those books or known of their existence until the day he showed them to me. He wanted me to keep them, which I did for several years, until I finally donated them to the Marine Corps Museum. Much later, a few excerpts from the Blue Manual also appeared in our veterans' newspaper, Guadalcanal Echoes. What I had to say was no more and probably no less important than information the Army colonels gathered from many other Marines. One thing I noticed when I read the manual was that often each Marine had his own way of dealing with any number of different combat situations. Many answers varied from one Marine to another, but all our answers shared the qualities of common sense and hard-earned experience. The excerpts that follow are just a few of the replies we gave, as they appeared in the Blue Manual. Travel light. For example, to hell with the mess equipment. We used our mess cup and spoon for the first 15 days here and enjoyed our chow. But you don't have to live like a gentleman in jungle warfare. Our mess equipment is too bulky for this type of warfare and it makes noise. Not every man can lead a battalion. Find out who can lead your battalions before you go into the combat areas. Colonel Edson's remark, I would like to concur in that statement. We are learning the hard way to move quietly in this jungle. I have been fired at many times by snipers and haven't seen one yet. The sabres which the Japanese officers carry have proved to be worthless. I killed 2 Japanese who came at me with sabres, and I got them first by shooting them. But I wished I had in reserve a good jungle knife. I don't mean a bolo, which we should have for cutting trails, but a knife with a 12-inch blade of good steel. We could use it against these Japanese, and also use it for cutting vines that catch on us when we move through jungle terrain at night. Sergeant T. E. Rumbley, I Company, 5th Marines. Our 60 mm mortars are fine weapons if you have observers who know their stuff. The mortar was not stressed enough in our training. If the numbers on the mortar sight were luminous, with a luminous strip on the stick, we would not have to use the flashlight. This flashlight business is dangerous. Sipalov Fred Carter, I Company, 5th Marines. On the Matanikau River, we got to firing at each other because of careless leadership by the junior leaders. We are curing ourselves of promiscuous firing, but I should think new units would get training to make the men more careful. We learned not to fire unless we had something to shoot at. Doing otherwise discloses your position and wastes ammunition. I have been charged twice by the Japanese in a bayonet charge. Our Marines can out-bayonet fight them, and I know our Army men will do the same. Note by Colonel Edson. Incidentally, in our last push, we executed 3 bayonet charges. A Japanese trick to draw our fire was for the hidden Japanese to work his bolt back and forth. Men who got sucked in on this and fired without seeing what they were firing at generally drew enemy automatic fire from another direction. Every scout should be taught to look in the trees. I was a scout and was shot in the shoulder by a Japanese in a tree. I look in the trees now. We take turns being scouts, so all should be trained as scouts. Sergeant O.J. Marion, L Company, 5th Marines, a platoon guide. You crawl when making an advance, unless you are to charge and make it. The reason is that all men who are hit from the knees up, except for ricochets. We've been able to crawl up to within 25 yards of a machine gun that's firing over our backs. The Japanese don't depress their machine guns. Note by Colonel Edson. I saw men of Company L doing this. Men get killed rushing to help a wounded man. If the wounded man would crawl about 10 yards to his flank, he can generally be aided in safety, as the Japanese seem to fire down lanes in jungle combat. Remark by Colonel Edson. We have taught our men that the best way to aid a wounded man is to push ahead so that the wounded man can be cared for by the corpsman following behind. Men have to be trained to act individually, for when the firefight starts, the corporal can't see all his men, and further, when the order for an attack is given, any number of men are unable to see the man on his right or left. So you see, sir, it takes guts for men to get up and move forward when the signal is given. The men have to learn to depend on one another and have confidence in each other. I was caught in one advance when the Japanese let us come through, and then rose up out of covered foxholes and shot at our backs. The best cure for that is a rear guard looking towards the rear. A few years ago, a fellow veteran of the canal wrote to Guadalcanal Echoes, inquiring about what he believed was a rare booklet. It turned out that he was referring to fighting on Guadalcanal. Until then, it hadn't occurred to me that the booklet had become rare. I had my copy of it stashed in a footlocker, the same copy that the army officer had given me back in 1945. I searched around the house a little, found that old footlocker, opened it up, and sure enough, there it was. The booklet wasn't doing me any good anymore, so I mailed it off to the Guadalcanal Veterans Museum. I'm glad I gave it to them, but I've thought about that booklet many times since then. Those of us who contributed to it, each in our own small way, would like to think it helped save a few American lives. When highly decorated and victorious Japanese commanders like General Kawaguchi, Colonel Ichiki, and Colonel Oka, all three of them in command of battle-tested troops, told their superiors that they would attack Guadalcanal, force the Americans to capitulate, and retake the island's airfield, they were as deadly serious as they could be. Up to that point, they had never known defeat. After years of rolling over and through all their enemies, they felt invincible. That was especially true as they prepared to face a motley crew of mostly young, untested, and abandoned American Marines on Guadalcanal. In the 1930s, the Japanese decided that the best and cheapest way to get minerals, lumber, and other resources was to invade Manchuria and just take it for themselves. With a few bombings, some well-placed artillery fire, and the advantage of facing an ill-equipped and poorly trained Chinese army that was best at running the wrong way, the Japanese Imperial Army started its steamroller exercises. After conquering the Chinese Manchurian army and invading that country, the Japanese army intimidated the population by employing brute terror that included indiscriminate killing of men, women, and children, a scorched earth policy, beheading the educated, forced prostitution, forced labor, and imprisoning and starving still others for no obvious reason. At that time, a romantic Japanese composer wrote a famous song, Manchurian Nights, which later got a new set of words from American fighting men and became known as She Ain't Got No Yo-Yo. But if you happen to be a Manchurian, those nights weren't very romantic. Well before the Japanese started their march south from Manchuria into mainland China, their reputation for brutality preceded them. When they went on the attack, word was quickly passed along that the Japanese were coming, and Chinese troops faded into the mist. As a result, there were few documented battles, as the Japanese easily occupied most important sections of the country that had the largest land mass in Asia. The assault of Nanking, the bombing of the USS Panay, and the bombing of downtown Shanghai continued to terrorize both the Chinese population at large and Chinese military forces. As the Japanese moved south through Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and Singapore, and even though they were greatly outnumbered in many of the battles, they rolled through Dutch and British defences, partly because the reputation of their brutality preceded them, and partly because their enemies' will to stand and defend had largely disappeared. They conquered everything and everyone they met. The Imperial Japanese Army was invincible, and its leaders were arrogant. In 1942, on Guadalcanal, the Japanese army saw its chance to teach the Americans the same lesson they'd been teaching everybody else. Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki, with a detachment of 900 of Japan's best soldiers, attacked the Marines' eastern perimeter, trying to cross Alligator Creek at the Battle of the Tenaru River on August 20th, 21. Ichiki's force made a semi-route march that culminated with a banzai formation. The presumably battle-seasoned Ichiki seemed to think that as soon as those untested Americans saw his troops approaching, the US Marines would do what everyone else had done, grab ass and run. But the good colonel soon found out that those young soldiers of the 1st Marine Regiment weren't grabbing anything. Instead, they stayed, fought back, and generally kicked butt. When it was over, Japanese dead littered the banks of the Tenaru, and Ichiki's body was among them. Major General Kayataki Kawaguchi and his combined force almost made it at Edson's Ridge on September 12, 14, and again the Marines didn't run. Short of ammo and short of chow, but having nowhere to go, the Marines stayed, slugged it out against the numerically superior Japanese, and stacked them high. At the same time, Colonel Oka attacked Marine lines at several places on the Matanikau End, L Company's combat area, while his troops advanced in a route march formation. Apparently he too was under the impression that we stupid Americans would see him, drop our weapons and bug out. The stupidity was all his. My own unit played an important part in routing Oka. Today, Japanese representatives search old battle areas on Guadalcanal, still trying to find the remains of Oka's troops so that they can return the bones to the homeland and enshrine them with the remains of their ancestors. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese attacks went on, probing one place or another along the American line, until finally the Imperial Headquarters staff in Tokyo began to understand that Guadalcanal had become a turning point in their Pacific land, sea, and air battle. The war was turning against them. At Guadalcanal, the Imperial staff bit off more than it could chew. Its fighting forces ran into the US Marines, then later found themselves up against the Army's well-equipped Americal Division, which finally secured the island. Facing the Marines, the Japanese were facing American fighting men who had been abandoned, who never had enough ammo or chow, but who had nowhere to go. The Japanese military ran into American sailors who'd gotten tired of getting kicked around and having to swim for their lives. They also ran into American airmen, flying in patched-up airplanes, but still capable of leaving deep, long-lasting impressions on those self-deluded leaders who had thought they were invincible. The battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal were a 1-2 punch, the first decisive blows that spelled defeat to the previously unbeaten Japanese Army and Navy. In 1945, when Japan surrendered, I was with the occupation forces on the Japanese mainland. I was among the Americans who came face to face with Japanese troops being returned home from conquered lands and demobilized. As they turned over their weapons to us, hatred showed in their eyes. Probably nobody in the world had known it back in the summer and fall of 1942, but Guadalcanal had been the beginning of the end for the Japanese. They tried to defeat the raggedy-ass US Marines on the canal, and they couldn't do it. It was on or about December 7th, 1942. I no longer remember the exact date, or even the time of day, but we were assembled on the beach, and we knew we were finally getting the hell off Guadalcanal. A transport ship stood well out to sea, its boats coming toward us on their way in to pick us up. They were Higgins boats, the same type that had landed us ashore back in August, but this time they were taking us home. Well, not quite home, but to Australia, which was a good second choice. When they arrived at the beach, we climbed aboard, and as each boat filled with Marines, it headed back out toward the ship. We were on our way to the USS President Jackson, a Navy transport that would take us to Brisbane, a handsome city on Australia's east coast. Our Higgins boat ploughed through the water, its diesel engine throbbing steadily, and like everyone around me, I was glad to be off the canal. Some of the guys looked back. They got their last glimpse of what was truly a beautiful island, all green with its wide white sand beaches. Some of them looked back all right, just long enough to thumb their noses at Guadalcanal before they said goodbye. I didn't look back. I looked straight out to sea, watching the Jackson, which seemed to grow larger as we approached. Its cargo nets had been dropped down the side of the hull, which was the standard way for troops to go aboard. Our Higgins boat came abreast of the Jackson, and like those around me, I reached out, grabbed the net, and started to scramble toward topside. I'd been scrambling up the sides of ships since the days when those harder-to-climb Jacob's ladders were the most common way for a marine to board ship. But this day's climb was the toughest one of my life. That was true not only for me, but for all of us. Every last marine getting off Guadalcanal was weak after 4 energy-sapping months of combat, sickness, and too little food. I, for one, wasn't climbing that net with anything like the same speed that I'd always managed in the old days. Even so, I kept on going. Finally, I made it to the top, feeling the Jackson's deck solid beneath my feet. One of the first things I did was look down along the side of the hull I'd just finished climbing. A few of our guys were on their way up directly behind me. Many others were halfway up, and still others had made it maybe 3/4 of the way, but many of them had simply stopped moving. They had their arms wrapped in and around the nets, and they were hanging on for dear life, too weak to climb any further. A first burst of energy, or maybe it was just that powerful desire to get the hell off Guadalcanal, had been enough to take them partway up the net, but that was as far as they could go. It took me a minute or so to realize their trouble. They hadn't stopped for a second to catch their breath. They'd stopped because they'd run out of strength. I was taking my pack off my back when a sailor who stood near me said, "What's the matter with those damn Marines? Look at them." The matter with those damn Marines was that they were half-starved, suffering from any of several jungle diseases, and too weak to climb those nets without help. When I reflect back, I get angry at those Navy brass sons of bitches. You would have thought they'd have told the sailors what condition we were in. They didn't tell their people we didn't have any food, that we were starving. Aboard ship, they were only getting 2 squares a day. They couldn't see that we were sick, that some guys who had been able to fight the Japanese in hand-to-hand combat now could only wrap their arms around the ropes and hold on for dear life. They didn't realize we'd been climbing those damned cargo nets for 3 years and could run right up the side of the ship when we were healthy and fed. A couple of the Jackson's sailors who were on duty topside and near the embarkation stations had a little more sense than that wise guy who had made the remark. They saw what was happening, and realizing how weak our guys were, they started going down the nets to help them. They pushed and pulled and heaved our guys up and on deck. These many years later, I thank them sincerely for their help. At least one of our guys had tears running down his face because he couldn't make it up that damned net. Another man who happened to be in my unit lost the trigger group out of his bar while he was struggling up the net. Our bars were relics from World War I. 2 safety pins held the trigger group in place, and a combination of age and hard use on the battlefield eventually loosened those pins. The kid was hanging onto the cargo net for dear life, the bar slung on his back, and with the ship's movement, the net kept swinging a little, making his climb that much harder. The trigger group on his weapon must have jostled loose, fallen out of the gun, and disappeared into the ocean, but the kid didn't realize it until he'd made it up on deck. Then, with the rest of us, he moved down below, where he had a few seconds to pull his gear together. He reported the loss of his trigger group to me. I had to report it to the gunny, who made a big issue out of it. You'd think it was the poor kid's fault. What had sent us down below in the first place was the familiar wail of the air raid siren, which meant a squadron of Japanese bombers was on its way to pay another one of its daily visits. With enemy bombers approaching, the ship's skipper had to get the Jackson underway in a hurry. The Jackson began to pick up speed, then started making the zigzag maneuvers that ships always make when an enemy attack is impending or in progress. Several more Higgins boats filled with Marines were still on their way toward the Jackson. As they came abreast of the ship, I watched the kids in those Higgins boats struggle to grab the cargo net on the moving ship. Each man would wait his turn, then time himself and jump to grab hold of the swinging net and start his climb. That's how most of them got aboard the Jackson. When my unit was ordered down below, we kept right on going, deeper and deeper, until we found ourselves in a compartment with no ventilation to speak of. We were a sorry crew, sick, dirty, stinking, half-starved, and now we were stuck deep in the ship's bowels, where we choked on old, stale air while outside bombs started coming down from Japanese planes. Like the others, I was in poor shape, my weight down from my then normal 130 pounds to about 90 pounds. Even the biggest guys in our unit were as weak and underweight as the rest of us, with maybe the heaviest guy in the platoon weighing in at around 135 pounds. We couldn't even sit down comfortably on a bench because the bones of our butts stuck out against our skin. We were stuck deep down below in that stinking ship's compartment, listening to muffled explosions of Japanese bombs. The ship didn't take any hits, but we remained trapped in that compartment for a good half hour before they finally opened the hatch and led us up, directing us towards the ship's mess hall. At long last, we were served some decent food. I took that first delicious warm bowl of thick macaroni soup, gobbled it up like a madman, and then proceeded to throw it up. I needed a second and then a third bowl before I finally managed to get food into my stomach and keep it down. A little earlier, when they had finally let us out of that deep compartment where we waited out the Japanese air raid, I told myself, if I'm going to die, there's nothing I can do about it. But from now on, there's one thing I'm not going to do. I'm not going to die deep down in the damned hold of some old rust bucket of a Navy ship. That was a promise I made to myself and kept. I never allowed anybody to get me deep down below ships like that again. A few years later, serving with a different outfit and on my way to and from a different bloody engagement, the Battle of Iwo Jima, my unit was ordered down below on several occasions. Most of the others followed orders, but not me. I remember telling one sailor, "Hold it!" "What's up?" he said. I spent 30 years in the Corps, including a decade assigned to the Fleet Reserves, and when I officially retired from the Marine Corps in 1970, you never really sever the cord. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since I had gone through the Guadalcanal ordeal with so many good and long-time friends. It dawned on me years later, and only after I joined the Guadalcanal campaign veterans, that although it was but one island, 3 totally different Guadalcanals exist in the memories of the servicemen who were there during World War II. That realization hit me slowly, and only after I started getting copies in the mail of the Guadalcanal Campaign Veterans Quarterly newspaper, Guadalcanal Echoes. I started seeing pictures and reading stories about the canal, and nearly every time a new issue came into my home, I found myself opening the paper, then repeating to myself, "This can't be Guadalcanal. Where the hell did those guys get the cameras to take those pictures during the campaign?" At the time we fought the Japanese on that island, it was a court-martial offence for any of us to have cameras and take pictures. Obvious exceptions were made in the cases of war correspondents and certain personnel at command headquarters, but all combat Marines were told explicitly that cameras were forbidden. But in just about any issue of Echoes, I'd be likely to see, for instance, a photo taken back during the war showing a PX, or men in khaki uniforms eating chow in a nice, comfortable mess tent, or a picture of a bakery. A bakery? Another issue had a photo of a post office. A post office? Do they have the right island? I started asking myself. Who in hell are these imposters, and where are these pictures coming from? Recalling Guadalcanal in my mind's eye, it's very difficult for me to accept the fact that the photos and some of the stories that I've read in Echoes in recent years are about the real Guadalcanal. Here's another oddity that came in the form of a query from one of the paper's readers. Does anyone remember mules on Guadalcanal? Many affirmative replies were sent in, and some had photos to back up their stories. Mules. I responded to Echoes with a short note of my own, saying that if mules had been on the canal, we would have eaten them. It turns out that I was wrong about mules, and about other details too. Facts aside, I've discovered that sensory impressions also differ wildly from one veteran to another. Somebody once wrote a short piece to Echoes and mentioned the sweet, flowery smell of jasmine drifting out to sea. I recall the smell of jasmine too, but only years after my Guadalcanal experience. When my wife, my son and I lived in Sunland, California, We had night-blooming jasmine growing all around our home, but I never smelled jasmine on the canal. The smells that remain as part of my Guadalcanal memories are rotted vegetation and the nauseating stink of dead, rotting bodies. But I've had to rearrange my memories and my thoughts. I've had to start putting a few things in perspective and draw a few new conclusions. I now realize that there were at least 3 different Guadalcanals, remembered by 3 different waves of troops who spent time there. The first Guadalcanal is the one I know and remember, the Guadalcanal that existed from August to December 1942. That Guadalcanal consists of a small perimeter along the beach, starting just short of the Tanaru River, stretching westward to a point several hundred yards beyond the village of Kukum, and extending irregularly inland never more, and often much less, than a few thousand yards to the island's first line of high coral ridges. That first Guadalcanal was also an island of shortages. We were always short of rifle ammo, and always begging for a few precious rounds of supporting high-angle fire from our mortars and field guns. We were always short of food and water, and all we had to wear were the shoes and clothes we'd come ashore with. We were short of mosquito nets, quinine, and medical supplies. We saw very little incoming mail, and we had no paper or pencils to write letters home. I never saw a post office on my Guadalcanal, and I never saw anything that looked remotely like a PX. There were no movies, no mess tents, no bakery, no starched khaki uniforms, and in my experience, not one single damned mule. We were the island's animals, living on the ground and under the ground, and eating food that no mule would ever accept. One thing we did have in large supply was incoming rounds of enemy fire. We were bombed and shelled day and night. Another thing we had in large supply was illness, mainly malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers. We went on patrol nearly every day, and we grew thinner every day from lack of food. Our wounded were evacuated only if and when a plane or a ship was able to come in and take them off the island, and that wasn't often. Sometimes they let us go swimming at night, but that was to push in barrels of aviation gas that the Yippie boats had dumped overboard for us to retrieve. The first Guadalcanal, my Guadalcanal, was also the island that overwhelmed us with the feeling that we'd been abandoned. On too many occasions, the ships intended to bring in supplies and reinforcements would get shot up by the enemy, then would take off and disappear, and we would see no further sign of the US Navy for several weeks. That was my Guadalcanal. One thing we did have was the constant threat of death, which was made palpable by the dirty, rotten stink of death that clung to our hair, our clothes, our teeth, and even the balls of our feet. Death was always with us. After December 1942, and for the next 4 or 5 months, a second Guadalcanal came into being. But L.5 and the rest of the 1st Marines were no longer there to experience it. The second Guadalcanal was an island where the American perimeter moved outward in all directions. It was an island where the army mopped up pockets of Japanese resistance, and where American naval and air power grew stronger day by day. Luckily for the troops who had to be there, it was an island of better living conditions for all of them. Mail call became frequent, and ammunition and medical supplies grew plentiful. This possibly was the Guadalcanal that saw its first US post office, and maybe even had something resembling its first PX and bakery. This second Guadalcanal was still a tough island to live on, but if you didn't get clobbered by enemy fire, and more often than not you didn't, you were finding that the canal was at least halfway livable. The third Guadalcanal tells us a completely different story. After the last of the Japanese were either killed or driven off, the third Guadalcanal developed into an island with large airfields, large supply depots, huts, theatres, PX, post offices, laundries, and a large marine training base. The 3rd and 6th Marine Divisions trained there in preparation for other battles that would be fought closer to the Japanese homeland. But the only Guadalcanal that I experienced was the first one. Early in December 1942, what was left of the 5th Marine Regiment left my Guadalcanal on Higgins boats that took us to the transport ship USS President Jackson, which carried us the relatively short distance out of the combat zone to the handsome city of Brisbane, on Australia's east coast. I want to say thanks to the men in the Jackson's galley for serving those much-needed, good-tasting bowls of warm macaroni soup once we'd managed to get below decks. The thing that struck me as strange about that soup was the fact that it didn't have any maggots in it. Food with maggots in it? That was my Guadalcanal. On the first of 3 Guadalcanals, my Guadalcanal, some of our weapons were good and others were bad. The raising gun was a piece of junk that I soon learned was giving everybody else the same trouble it had given Wild Bill Kulchiki when we fought the first battle at the Matanikau. The Marines' rifle during the Guadalcanal campaign was better. It was a leftover from World War I, the bolt-action Springfield 03, but in spite of its age, it was accurate and dependable. Many infantrymen would argue that the newer Garand .30 caliber semi-automatic rifle, better known as the M1, was superior to the 03, but for better or worse, the Marines on the canal didn't get to use it. The M1 hadn't been in production for very long back in '42, and it was still being distributed to the US Army's combat units. The Marines wouldn't get the M1 until all Army units received their full issue, and by that time the Guadalcanal campaign was over. The Springfield 03 lacked the M1's obvious advantage of being semi-automatic, which enabled it to be fired at a more rapid rate, but some good riflemen liked it better than the M1. One holdover weapon from World War I that nobody argues about is the famous BR, the Browning automatic rifle. It was the most potent and dependable all-around semi-automatic and automatic weapon that the Marine infantrymen took to Guadalcanal. The BAR, a .30 caliber weapon, first saw service in France during World War I, but old doesn't necessarily mean out of date. It was beautifully designed and built, it was rugged, and it remained a favorite weapon of American Army and Marine combat infantrymen in all theaters of World War II. Prior to our leaving New River, North Carolina, in 1942, the 1st Marine Division held the bar in such high esteem that Division Command decided to add a 4th squad to what previously had been our standard 3-squad rifle platoons. The newly created squad was a bar squad. It contained 8 men, including the squad leader, who was a corporal, an assistant squad leader, 3 BR men, and 3 assistant BR men who doubled as ammunition carriers. The addition of the BR squad revolutionized the concept of the rifle platoon because it gave the platoon leader 3 additional automatic small arms weapons that could be used as weapons of opportunity once the platoon was committed to a specific course of action in a combat situation. At the same time, the BR squad gave the company commander freedom to shift BAR teams within a platoon or lend an extra BR team to a different platoon according to the battle situation and plan. Before the addition of the bar squad, Marine rifle platoons typically had 1 or sometimes 2 bars to augment the 03 rifles in each of its 3 squads. In that older configuration, the strength of the squad and distribution of BRs was controlled by the varying number of men in a given company and within the company's 3 platoons. The addition of 9 additional Browning automatic rifles to an infantry company made a dramatic difference in intensified firepower. From our standpoint, it seemed like giving the company commander free access to Fort Knox. And the most important factor in the effectiveness of this increased firepower was the excellence of the weapon itself. It's safe to say that the firepower, accuracy, and durability of the BAR played a very important part in the defeat of the Japanese army. In stories about L Company that I've been recalling here, as well as in many others that I wrote several years ago for Guadalcanal Echoes, I haven't always given full credit to the support elements from other units that accompanied us at times when we were in the middle of an offensive thrust or defending a position against enemy action. For readers unfamiliar with the structure of a Marine infantry battalion during World War II, let me explain that our 3rd Battalion was typical in that it consisted of 3 rifle companies, I, K, and L, plus a weapons company designated M Company. M Company's main weapons in 1942 were water-cooled .30 caliber heavy machine guns, HMGs, and 81mm mortars. Each time L Company dug in at a defensive position, we were assigned a section of machine guns from M Company. The machine gun sections were rotated among the 3 rifle companies until, Over the duration of our stay on the canal, we came to know every one of the HMG crewmen almost as well as we knew our own squad members. When they were attached to L Company, members of a machine gun crew became part of our unit, and we treated them as such. And when it got down to the nitty-gritty, we could usually rely on a few mortar rounds from M Company's 81mm guns. Owing to chronic shortages of ammunition, a few rounds were usually as many as they could spare, but we were glad to get them. As the old song about mortars goes, "They're over and under. If they're on, it's a wonder. So cheer up, my lads, bless them all." Whenever Gunny Sergeant Borgerson could spare a round or two to aid us in our defence, those rounds were on. Well, most of the time they were on. Early on during the Canal campaign, a 37mm anti-tank gun was assigned to L Company's sector of the defence perimeter. That gun and its 4-man crew were dug in with us in the coconut grove, adjacent to the rough, unpaved road that went west along the shoreline to the Matanikau River, the area where the Japanese were dug in. It's the same gun I referred to earlier when I described our defence of the western perimeter against Oker's unit on the morning of September 14th. On that occasion, that 37mm fired about a dozen canister rounds into a mass assault that the Japanese were trying to mount, and those rounds, combined with our HMGs, our bars and our rifles, broke up that attack before it had a proper chance to get started. Those guys manning the 37mm stayed in the grove with us for about a month. Both the men from M Company and the 4-man anti-tank gun crew were vital components in L Company's successful defence of our sector of the perimeter. We owed a lot to Gunny Smallwood and Sergeant Harry Miller, after the war, Reverend Harry Miller, and their guys from M Company. We also owed thanks to Sergeant Davidson and his 37mm crew that came to us from regiment. They were all great Marines and good friends. During the early stages of World War II, communications equipment in a Marine rifle company consisted of a couple of hand-cranked power phones and the 2 words scarce and bad. However, when a combat situation broke out at close hand, a couple of sparks from regiment would join our company command post, and from there they were able to crank out an occasional message. The radio man, always informally known as Sparks, would become part of our outfit, as was the case when L Company went on that mid-August combat patrol to the Matanikau in search of the remains of the Goethe patrol. Lord, what big, heavy, noisy radios they brought to our unit, but we needed them badly, noise and all. Thanks, guys. Prior to the war, and continuing through the months of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Corps remained a small organisation. At one time or another, most of our NCOs knew personally, or served with, or at least knew by name, most of the officers and fellow NCOs in the Marines. That's the main reason why, when I reflect on the different stories I've written about L.5 on Guadalcanal, and realise that I haven't always given the names of outfits and warriors attached to our company, it's because to me every one of us was a part of just one closely knit corps. We were as close as brothers. After L Company's first month or so on the canal, putting up with 2-a-day bombings by Japanese planes, sporadic shelling by the big land artillery piece we'd nicknamed Pistol Pete, and frequent shelling from Japanese warships out on the bay, we pretended to be blasé about the whole business. We treated those noisy interruptions as routine happenings, especially the runs made by the 2-engine Japanese bombers. To save our raggedy asses, we dug spider holes, and we sometimes pulled a cover of some kind over our heads after jumping in, such as bamboo matting that the Japanese airfield construction crew had left behind. Down in our spider holes, we were generally safe from anything short of a direct hit. At the first wail of our air raid siren, or at the first sound that signalled approaching enemy airplane engines, we would stop whatever we were doing and start easing our way toward our spider holes. Japanese aircraft engines had a distinct sound of their own, easy to recognise because they were different from our own familiar Grumman, Douglas, Bell and Boeing warplanes. As we strolled toward cover, our conversations consisted of casual banter, pretended nonchalance, and normal poking fun at each other. At the same time, we'd occasionally sneak an over-the-shoulder skyward glance to see which direction the planes were coming from. Usually it was from the west, from somewhere beyond the Point Cruz-Matanicao direction. We didn't know it at the time, and it wouldn't have meant anything to us anyway, but that westerly direction meant that the enemy planes were coming from the important Japanese naval and air base at Rabaul. Often we'd also look in the direction of our airstrip to see if any of our planes were going up after the Japanese. If a couple of our Grumman F-4Fs made it up, I liked to watch the sky for a few extra seconds, taking satisfaction in the way our fighters zoomed in like angry bees, disrupting the bomber formation and sometimes knocking a few of the Mitsubishis down before those suckers had the chance to drop their loads inside our perimeter. Experience taught us a little bit about the trajectory of falling bombs. If the Japanese planes were directly above us when they released their loads, we could play it cool and pretend to be casual about jumping into our holes. That's because we knew that by the time the bombs struck the ground, they'd explode a safe distance away from us, probably on or near the airfield. If we saw the bombs being released as the planes were approaching us, we knew we were in trouble. Those suckers were coming in on us. We'd hurry towards safety, hit our spider holes, hug the earthen sides and bottoms, and wait out the thumps and blasts. For me, the screaming and whining of the downcoming bombs was more frightening than the actual explosions. The earth-shaking, knock-around rattle and roll that the blast and its concussion would hand us as our punishment from Tokyo. Whenever one of our fighter pilots got a good hit on a Japanese bomber, and it happened quite often, the enemy plane would scream toward the ground in a power dive, nose first, trailing black smoke, sometimes with parts falling off. That was a sight I'll never forget, but it also spelled a new kind of danger, and we knew we had to hit that spider hole fast. Usually the screaming, smoking, burning plane had a bomb or two aboard. When it hit the ground, all hell jarred loose. Once in a while, the normal whistling that accompanied falling bombs was joined by a new sound, the damnedest high-pitched woo-wee-wee-woo noise, a scream that was scary enough to shake the rice out of us. According to scuttlebutt that circulated after the first of those weird raids, the new noises were caused by empty sake bottles that the Japanese would drop on us along with their bombs. More scuttlebutt had it that from time to time, our own pilots dropped empty Coke bottles on enemy positions along with their bombs as a way to retaliate. No matter who was on the receiving end, the shriek was scary, something a little extra to shake up the troops in an attempt to lower morale. Another thing the Japanese planes did several times during the campaign's early days of August and September was to drop small sheets of foil down inside our perimeter. Anybody who'd been following the war in Europe knew that the tin foil was supposed to disrupt our radar and confuse our radar operators. If that was the Japanese intention on the canal, they were wasting their effort. There were plenty of supplies and a lot of equipment we Marines simply didn't get during our 4 months on the canal, and radar was one of them. We didn't know for sure why the Japanese were dropping that foil, so it was natural to assume the worst. A couple of our old veteran China hands warned us not to touch that damned foil. "It's probably dusted with chemicals that will burn holes in your flesh," one NCO said. Then, in a move that's typical of military outfits everywhere, the order to keep away from the foil was directly reversed. We were told to pick up the sheets and turn them in. It was one more work detail to keep the troops busy between visits from the Japanese. I'm sure that some of the guys who picked up that foil stashed a few sheets of it into a field pack or a pocket to save as a souvenir. I'll also bet that a few of today's old grandpas have forgotten all about the foil that they once brought back from the canal. Maybe they open an attic trunk or a half-forgotten footlocker, spot a couple of crumpled pieces of foil inside, and wonder what the hell they're looking at. I can't prove it and I won't try, but I believe that between August and December 1942, the Marines who were positioned inside that very small perimeter on Guadalcanal were bombed and shelled more than any other American unit in the Pacific Theater. L Company took casualties in ground combat, but to the best of my recollection, not one of us was killed or wounded by the bombing and strafing of Japanese planes. What saved us is clear enough to me: our spider holes. The canal survivors are proof that if you are properly dug in, it will take a direct hit to do you in. Whatever advantages and skills the Japanese military might have had in World War II, The accuracy of their bombers was definitely not one of them. Many years after the end of World War II, I started coming across a series of stories in Guadalcanal Echoes about veterans of the campaign who had been looking for and had finally found Mr. Akio Tani, aka Pistol Pete. For some of our guys, finding the one-time commander of that Japanese gun crew turned out to be a little bit like Stanley finding Livingston. I never shared their enthusiasm. Finding Pistol Pete will never be a big deal for me, because he remains today as he was in 1942, a persona non grata in my life. I am not a bitter person by nature. On the contrary, my World War II experiences have not controlled me or traumatized my life. In 1945, the war over, I started putting those experiences behind me, and I've gone on to live a largely happy, event-filled life. After the war was over, I served 2 tours of duty in Japan and became friends with a number of good Japanese people. On one occasion, I even took steps far beyond the call of duty to help a Marine cut through miles of red tape and marry a fine and lovely Japanese girl. I did, however, perceive World War II as a very serious happening, and my visual memories of many dead, wounded, maimed and crippled friends hit by enemy artillery fire just won't allow me to tell Mr. Tani that he and I are now good friends. On Guadalcanal, Rifle Company L.5 spent most of its time in the coconut grove at the far western edge of the Marines' perimeter, the part that faced toward the Matanikau River. Most of the rounds Pistol Pete fired at the airfield or at our Kukum facilities came from points far to our west, from somewhere across the Matanikau River. Most of them went safely over our heads. Occasionally, and maybe just to keep us honest, Pete threw a random round into our company area. On occasions when we happened to be involved in an activity that would be visible from a distance, like digging a well for drinking water or a bunker to climb into as a way of trying to save our hides, Pistol Pete might zero in on us. He'd send one round over a little long, a second round short, and a third round right on target. Zeroing in like that indicated that he had a forward observer watching us and helping him find his target. In time, we became blasé about Pistol Pete because the occasional rounds that he dropped into our defence area caused very little damage. But once in a while, Mr. Tani got lucky. Once one of our guys was sitting on the low stump of a coconut tree, just a few yards away from his foxhole, reading a small Bible that he always carried with him. He was a quiet, honest lad who really did read from his Bible when he had a moment to rest. Mr. Tani got the brass ring that day. The kid heard the incoming round at the very last second. He had time only to get up on his feet and was about to make a dash for his foxhole when the round landed right in front of him. It hit the ground right between his feet. There was a terrific explosion, and during the 5 to 7 seconds it took his disemboweled torso to fly into the air, then flop to the ground, a god-awful wail came out from his throat. I wish the Guadalcanal vets, who were so happy to find Mr. Tani, could have heard that dying kid's scream. I understand that Mr. Tani, a.k.a. Pistol Pete, is now an elderly, quiet gentleman. He was a soldier who was just carrying out his orders in 1942, the same way that we were carrying out our orders. Fine. Mr. Tani and I wouldn't know each other if we were the last 2 people remaining on the face of the earth. That's the way I want it. One day, as Buck Sergeant, I led a reconnaissance patrol. We were ordered to move out from the west end of our MLR, scout out the area through the coconut grove, keep moving as far as the Matanikau River, then circle back and report anything of military interest. We went all the way to the river that day, and except for the usual macaw and parrot squawking, we heard nothing out of the ordinary and saw nothing unusual. At the river, I signalled the men to turn and start heading back toward our perimeter. We took a slightly different route on our way back, moving through a section of underbrush that we hadn't patrolled recently. We had gone some distance when the point man signalled, halting the patrol and catching my attention. I moved forward to see what had stopped him. As I approached, he pointed into an area of heavy foliage. Something was in there behind the foliage, a large camouflaged object that took the shape of something man-made. I signalled the rest of the patrol to move up and form a large semicircle around the object, then stand fast and cover it with our weapons in case one or more Japanese were in there. We remained in place for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, watching and listening. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life inside that thick patch of leaves and branches that somebody unknown to us had used to camouflage something. But to camouflage what? My point man and I moved in a little closer and gradually made out that the object was a vehicle of some kind. We moved in closer yet. It was a flatbed truck, and clearly Japanese. "What's it doing here?" I asked myself. I didn't speak the words aloud. I didn't want to break the silence, but my mind was filled with questions. Why hadn't anybody seen it until now? How long had it been out here, and why? And the most important question of all, was it booby-trapped? I signalled back to a couple more men, moving them up to join us. While we covered the object with our rifles, they removed a few branches and a lot of loose foliage, and gradually the truck appeared beneath it all. One man crawled under the carriage, inspecting it for wires that might lead to explosives, or for anything else that might look suspicious. Another man carefully lifted the hood and gave the engine compartment a look-see. Carefully, I climbed into the truck's cab. I found that old-style ignition switch with gas and spark handles, and the needle on the gasoline gauge showed plenty of gas. Everything indicated that this was no trap. Everything looked okay. The rest of the patrol backed away to a safe distance, and I threw the switch that turned on the spark and gas. The engine kicked to life. It was as easy as that. With the engine idling, half of the patrol moved in and removed the rest of the camouflage. Then the entire patrol piled on, and we went chug-chugging and bouncing over the rough terrain and back through the coconut grove. I stopped the truck about 50 yards from our perimeter, parked our newly acquired vehicle, and we proceeded on foot back to our line of defence. At that time, morale in our unit had hit pretty close to rock bottom. To make things worse, what little information we brought back from our various scouting patrols didn't seem to make much of an impression or have much value. We might report, "We heard noises in the distance that sounded like vehicles, maybe like tanks." "Well, okay, we'll check it out further," would be the answer. Or maybe, after getting to a point where we could take a better look at Mount Austin, we'd say, "Looks like they're doing more cutting away at the foliage on that mountain." "Yeah? Okay, maybe we'll check it out." So today it was. "We found a truck in the grove today." "A truck? That's nice." The apparent lack of interest on the part of our superiors didn't encourage us to elaborate. In fact, we decided that the best thing we could do was take matters into our own hands. I took my men back out to the coconut grove and to our truck. Yes, by now it was our truck. We camouflaged the damned thing and decided that from now on it would be strictly for our own use. A few days later saw a US Army unit arriving on the canal to reinforce the Marines. We watched them moving around at Kukum, unloading supplies, equipment and food destined for their troops. It was about time we started seeing some decent supplies and equipment coming our way. To assist movement of all those goodies off the beach, the Corps Motor Transport had lined up a dozen or so trucks, both marine vehicles and trucks left behind by the Japanese. We in L Company decided to use a little of that famous Marine Corps initiative and help our Army comrades. Having been thoroughly trained in larceny back at New River, and adhering to the principle that even if it's nailed down, you pry it loose and take it away, I sauntered out to the beach and inspected the situation. I liked what I saw. Back at our position on the MLR, I rounded up plenty of volunteers. We proceeded to the nearby coconut grove, got our truck out from beneath its covering foliage, then moved ahead to join the line of vehicles that were transporting those many good things the Army had brought ashore. We patiently waited our turn. When our Japanese truck finally moved up to become number one in line, I announced to the supply people, "We're supposed to pick up foodstuff for the chow supply dump." It worked. It was as though we'd died and gone to heaven. The Army was loading case after case of foodstuffs on our flatbed, peaches, canned hams, fruit juices, and other good things that we'd have been willing to kill or die for. I cannot say that we drove our truck to the 1st Marine Division supply dump. That would be a lie. Instead, our truck made an abrupt left turn, which quickly took us back to the section of the MLR defended by L.5. As we arrived, others from our unit already were busy digging holes to bury the loot they knew we'd be bringing back with us. One practical-minded NCO was drawing a hasty sketch of the company area, a kind of map that showed the locations of the holes and listed the contents that were now disappearing into each of them. 2 cases of ham at one point, 2 cases of canned fruit at another. Before long, all evidence of our raid had disappeared, including the Japanese truck. Once again it was some 50 yards away in the coconut grove, safely camouflaged by a mound of fresh foliage. Still another incident when a little bit of larceny kept L Company's morale from sinking to rock bottom took place after I'd moved up in the world, from corporal and squad leader to sergeant, probably in October. My men were holding our regular position on the MLR, but after being stuck operating from that spot for about a month, we were ordered to move a few yards to the rear, to what was called a reserve position. We were getting a short rest, assuming that rest or anything like it was possible inside our perimeter. Moving a platoon of guys from Company L.5 off the MLR at that time and place was comparable to a civilian family packing up and moving to a different part of town on an hour's notice. But we did it, and the Japanese didn't cause problems during the short time it took us to make the move. My next instructions were to take my champions in small groups back to the relative safety of the Lunga River, where they could get themselves and the crummy clothes on their backs scrubbed up in fresh water. On my way back from one trip, 2 enterprising Marines, this is a polite way to describe a pair of expert, school-trained scroungers, got my permission to wander over to the village of Kukum just to see how the other half was living. At Kukum, an MP parading around the ramshackle structure that passed for a warehouse attracted their attention. The scroungers could only wonder, what was in there worth the trouble to post a guard? Being inquisitive young men, they wandered over to the building and started making small talk with the MP. What they learned struck them as information of great interest and momentous importance. The oversized shack, they were told, held a supply of Japanese chow and many cases of sake. But things that seem important at one moment can fade to insignificance the next, which is what happened as their conversation with the guard came to an abrupt halt. The air raid siren had started wailing, and the drone of approaching Japanese bombers filled the sky. Understandably, the MP was more interested in saving his skin than protecting captured stores. "Goodbye, you guys!" he yelled, as he ducked out of sight and into a bunker that had been built for his protection. Were my 2 buddies concerned about the approaching bombers? No way. What did concern them was the health and welfare of that large shack's contents. By now the bombers were in sight, and the thump of exploding bombs was shaking the very earth beneath their feet. The time had come for them to find an air raid shelter, and the warehouse was the nearest shelter at hand. They ducked inside and saw at a glance that what the MP had told them was true. All hell was breaking loose outside, but there in that haven they beheld stacks of canned Japanese food and case after case of sake. It occurred to them, they told me later, that if a bomb ever scored a hit on this shack, everything would be lost forever. Better, they decided, to salvage a couple of precious items right now and run for it. Grabbing 2 large bottles of sake apiece, they burst out of the warehouse and ran for their lives as bombs fell and exploded all around them. Later, when they explained their protective attitude to me, I began to suspect that these scroungers had the makings of officer material in their souls. Anyhow, I understood their intentions and couldn't find it in my heart to disapprove of their action. Back at our new reserve position, the scrounging duo told everybody their story while they shared the contents of those 4 magnum-size bottles with the rest of the platoon. Lubricated with sake, our imaginations began working double time, and we started planning and plotting future action. What we needed was a surefire method to protect the rest of those fragile glass bottles in that Kukum shack. We all had ideas to volunteer, and after lengthy discussion we worked out a solution. It required the use of a machine gun cart, which our neighbours in the heavy machine gun section of M Company were eager to lend when hearing of our fortune. They were anxious to cooperate in the delicate tactical exercise we had concocted. Our friends in the Japanese Air Force had become reliable visitors, making regular round trips from Rabaul to say hello. We knew we could count on their appearance at nearly the same time every day. Next day, as the air raid warning sounded, 2 future men of the cloth, alias our original pair of scroungers, took off on the double, making a dummy run in the direction of the warehouse. Just as they expected, they saw the MP do whatever he could to save his life by diving into his bunker and vanishing out of sight. So far, so good. The 3rd day arrived, and so did the Japanese bombers, preceded as always by the siren's wail. Once again our scroungers took off like a pair of scalded geese, but this time the machine-gun cart went bouncing with them along the sun-baked road. They arrived at the warehouse just as the bombs began falling. Taking a second to look around, they saw that the MP and everybody else in the area had ducked for cover. Everybody except them. Wasting no time, these brave men dashed into the shack and hauled the cart inside with them. Within moments they loaded 2 cases of sake on the cart and covered their treasure with a poncho. Back outside again, and heedless of the bombs bursting in air, they made it all the way back to our reserve position. Bombs or no bombs, they travelled much slower now. The precious cargo merited maximum care. The week that followed saw a total of 4, maybe 5 trips to that warehouse and back. Every time the Japanese bombers made their round trip from Rabaul, our stout-hearted scroungers made their own round trip from Company L.5's reserve position, and by that time every man in the company had a few goods to diminish hunger and thirst, not the least of those goods being a sake bottle, which he swore to guard and protect. The bottle's contents didn't need guarding. They were put to good use. A pull each morning, just before moving out on patrol, helped make our day, and our eyeballs, a little brighter and sharper. The sake's afterglow nearly made us overlook the miserable situation that we were in. Almost, but not quite. But sooner or later, all good things must end. It wasn't long before the company was moved to a new position, and this time we were too far away from the warehouse to continue making those air raid trips. But where there are scroungers with a will, there is a way, and by now every man in L.5 had learned to be an accomplished, academically trained scrounger. We'd been educated by a pair of PhDs in scrounging. Whenever rumours of liberated chow or liquid spirits drifted through the island's fetid jungle air, we had a full platoon of men who were equal to the task of salvaging their fair share of it. When you've been sent off to war, mail call becomes a more important event than it is for most people in civilian life. At about the time the Guadalcanal campaign was heating up, one of the Hollywood studios released a movie titled From the Shores of Tripoli. Its star was a new, handsome young actor named John Payne. Meanwhile, several thousand miles away in the South Pacific, it happened that L.5's ranks included a very young Marine whose name was Piacete John R. Payne. Back in 1942, a lot of movies were being made about the war, and American girls were going to their neighbourhood theatres to see them. One of the favourites, largely thanks to actor John Payne, was From the Shores of Tripoli. Young ladies being what they were then, and still are, thank you, Lord, many of them immediately fell madly in love with the sight of the actor. Soon, quite a few of those girls were writing fan mail to the movie star, telling him how handsome and sexy they thought he was, and often making intimate suggestions that they certainly would never talk about with their mothers, let alone their pastors. Far from any Hollywood film studio at the time, cut off from civilization and confined to the jungles of Guadalcanal, how could I possibly know about those passionate and torrid letters? Like many other Marines in L.5, I know about those fan letters because several hundred love-struck young ladies addressed their letters, not to the actor's Hollywood studio, but to John Payne, U.S. Marine Corps. And many of those letters found their way to FPO San Francisco, from which point they were forwarded to the Pacific Theatre. Eventually, they found their way to Piacete John R. Payne, L.5. You have no idea of the entertainment those letters gave, not only to Piacete John R. Payne, but to all the rest of us in the platoon. We read the juicier sentences aloud for the rest of the guys to hear. Sometimes we'd take turns, hamming it up, reading those passionate messages with orator-style diction and dramatic gestures. In a place like Guadalcanal, where entertainment ranged between scarce and non-existent, those letters gave us a lot of laughs and were nearly as good as a visit from the USO. A second mail call incident was all my own. From the time I was a kid, I would read anything that happened to be available. That habit came to a temporary halt during boot camp at Paris Island, when from the crack of dawn till the moment his head hit his pillow at night, no recruit had a moment to call his own. After boot camp, I found reading to be as good a pastime as any, cheap enough that even a Marine private could afford it. Something from the Book of the Month Club, something from the ship's library, anything. I was one of several guys in my squad who joined book clubs, and every month we'd each order a different book. When we finished whatever we were reading, we'd trade books, which gave each of us the most reading for the least amount of money spent. I was a pretty fast reader, but my good buddy Larry Gherkin was slow. "Don't memorize the damned book," I'd tell him. "Just read it." "Marion, I'm going to bust your head," he'd answer. Then he'd go on reading, very slowly. In the summer of '42, we shipped out, first to New Zealand, and from there to war. That's when those fools at the Book of the Month Club dunned me. Late in our stay on the lovely island of Guadalcanal, when our planes were finally starting to get through with supplies, we had a mail call one day. "Marion," I heard, and I was handed a letter from the Book of the Month Club. I opened it and found out that I owed them $2.50 and that I was past due by 4 months. It was polite enough, but it said something like pay up or they'd take care of me. Well, I was just a little pissed. I'm out in the Pacific, eating rice and maggots and getting shot at by Japanese, while some fat ass in a comfortable chair back in the States is trying to get $2.50 out of my hide. So I wrote right there, on their letter, and mailed it back to them. If they ever bothered to read it, they could have felt the venom. I wrote, "Dear Sir, you're right. I owe you $2.50, and I ain't paying it. So if you don't like it, you just come out here and get me and drag my ass back to some soft, comfortable jail at home. Or Marion." I never did pay it. But years later, when I was living in California, my wife wanted to join the club, and I included with the form a note telling them that I had missed a payment when I was fighting in the Pacific. I got a brief letter back telling me that they no longer were collecting overdue bills from 1942. In the dog days of September and October '42, most of the ships that the US Navy had in the South Pacific were either being repaired after engagements with the enemy or hiding in safe island harbours. No ships or planes were heading to the canal to bring in badly needed supplies, and we were feeling the pain. One evening, just before dark, our platoon was ordered to Kukum Beach, where we were supposed to serve as a working party. Normally that meant a ship had arrived and we were being detailed to unload it. A few platoons from other units joined us, but when we looked out to sea, there wasn't a ship to be seen. There was nothing on the beach for us to move either, so we had nothing to do but sit on the sand, skylark, trade scuttlebutt, generally shoot it, and wonder if and when a ship would come in that evening. Or ever. The sun went down, and one more tropical night descended, sudden and pitch black as usual. Still there was nothing, no sign of any approaching ship. Then, about half an hour after dark, and from pretty far out over the water, we heard the first faint sound of an engine. At first, we didn't know what to make of it. Its pitch was different from anything we were familiar with. Right away, somebody from the Marine Shore Party unit showed up among us. I heard him tell our sergeant in charge that the boat we were hearing would probably make several passes parallel to the beach. At each pass, its crew would dump drums of aviation fuel overboard. My squad was assigned the detail of wading far enough out from the beach that the boat could approach us. We were instructed to grab hold of the gasoline drums as soon as they splashed overboard and then push them ashore. The other men in our platoon would roll the drums up on the beach as far as the berm line, where they'd be out of the enemy's clear view when daylight arrived. We waded into the dark sea. Our platoon had no sooner made it out to a point where the water was about waist high when we heard that unfamiliar boat's motor approaching very close to us, sounding almost as though it were in idle. And now we could see the vessel, make it out as a blacker, more solid shape against the black sky. Its silhouette took shape as a small seagoing craft that moved very slowly, parallel to the shoreline. A couple of voices sounded softly over the water from the boat's deck. "Heads up!" With that came a series of loud splashes, heavy objects falling into the sea. And that turned out to be all we ever heard from that boat. The sound of its engine, the voices of its crew calling softly as a caution to us. "Heads up!" and the succession of splashes. In 10 minutes or less, that crew's work was done. Without a further signal or a by your leave, the engine's pitch changed, and that dark, shadowy boat disappeared into the night. Our job of floating those 15 or 20 barrels of fuel ashore was easy, but the guys on the beach had a more difficult time, rolling the drums up over the sand and into cover behind the berm line. We had been visited that night by a Yippee boat. It was one of the many tuna boats that the Navy had commissioned from our west coast ports of San Diego, San Pedro, Monterey, and San Francisco. For quite a while, those mysterious nighttime boat visits were our only way of getting the supplies we needed in order to keep functioning as an effective military unit. The Navy gave those boats the designation YP, followed by an ID number, hence Yippee. Where they took on the supplies they shipped to us, I don't know, but we were told that those West Coast fishermen reached us by dodging from island to island across the South Pacific, hiding in coves when they had to, making fast runs when they could, and timing their movements to approach Guadalcanal and arrive at Kukum Beach just after total darkness. Months later, when I was off the canal and recovering from a severe bout of malaria and malnutrition at a hospital in Melbourne, Australia, I met a sailor who told me that while he was assigned to the motor pool on Tulagi, he encountered an old high school friend from Point Loma, California. His friend explained how the Yippee boats came into being. The father of his buddy was a fisherman and the owner and captain of a tuna boat out of San Diego. The Navy had taken the boat over, the way they were doing with many others like it. They commissioned the skipper and his 8-man crew after a week or so of indoctrination and had them sworn into the Navy. There they were. As fast as that, they had become part of the U.S. Navy. Next, they sailed across the South Pacific, snooping and drooping among the islands, doing whatever they could to keep us combat units supplied and operational. It always has been the case at every naval station that you'll see many small, non-combatant boats, not ships, but small boats, each manned by a crew of not more than 8 or 10 men. You'll see these boats zipping around among the harbour's ships and docks, taking care of odds and ends, moving small items and equipment from dockside to vessels, or from one ship to another. The Yippee boats and their crews were among the many unsung heroes of the war in the Pacific. In total, they constituted a relatively few men who operated only a handful of boats, all of them taking care of those countless small details that were never foreseen by the Navy's operational planners. Throughout the war, the Yippee boats went quietly about their work, which, for the benefit of 10,000 Marines on the canal, turned out to be vitally important. Little or no mention has been made of the Yippee boats' visits to us. Too little credit is given for all the good work they did. In the years following World War II, I've often talked with Guadalcanal campaign veterans who'd been aboard ships and involved in sea battles on and near Iron Bottom Sound. More recently, it occurred to me that many of the guys didn't realize that the Marines on Guadalcanal had a ringside seat for most of those naval engagements. Manning beach defense positions, or being located on one of the high outer ridges near the defense perimeter, we usually had Savo and the Florida Island Group in plain sight. Under most conditions when we were on a high ridge, we had a view of the canal's coastline looking west nearly all the way to Cape Esperance, which is at the island's tip. When on patrol or in a defilade area, a spot where we had set up protective fortifications, our view of the sea would be temporarily hidden. But more often than not, we had a clear, unobstructed view of many miles of surrounding water. Those now famous sea battles that gave Iron Bottom Sound its name would start as a sudden disruption of a quiet, often moonless night. The Japanese had the habit of choosing the darkest nights to begin sea battles. From out of the silent blackness, there would come a shattering, often frightening wham, bang. We'd see flashes from big naval gun barrels, and then more flashes from their exploding shells. Searchlights would suddenly blink on from one ship and sweep another ship's outline, a favourite Japanese sea battle tactic, and illuminating flares would silhouette still another ship's superstructure. Somebody in our squad would usually say, "Man, we're giving them hell tonight." Maybe what was really happening was that they were giving us hell, but naturally we always hoped for the best. At first light of day, following one of those terrific night battles, we would usually see some of our ships smoking and limping on the water, or, like the heavy cruiser Atlanta on that November morning, being scuttled after their crews were forced to abandon ship. Maybe one or two other cruisers would limp slowly away, missing a stern or a bow or a part of the superstructure. The smaller destroyers seemed luckier somehow. We'd see them towing larger vessels, while open boats would be casting off from our dock at Kukum to pick up survivors. Looking down at the beach from one of our ridge positions, we'd see the shoreline cluttered with oil-soaked and blackened sailors who had abandoned their sinking ships and managed one way or another to make it to land. Many of them were wounded. All of them were tired. We in the 1st Marine Division, well aware that we'd been abandoned earlier by our Navy and were now witnessing American losses at sea, found the aftermath of those naval engagements doubly depressing. Luckily, most of us were young and naive, and it seldom took much to raise our spirits again and give us back our natural and customary optimism. We had very few sound reasons to believe we were going to win, but we were young enough and optimistic enough to assume against all odds that we would see the campaign to its end and defeat the enemy. There were a few times when something tangible occurred to brighten our mood. On one occasion, we looked out to sea at daybreak and saw a very large warship that appeared beached on Savo Island. 2 of our planes, probably all we could get into the air at the time, were making low-level, high-speed round trips between Henderson Field and that big enemy ship. Each time they flew over it, they dropped a couple of bombs, and the Japanese ship appeared too badly crippled to put up any resistance. A Japanese ship finally sunk. On many a day, lying on the ground, or sometimes sitting against the base of a coconut tree, we had a very good view of air battles between the Japanese Zeros and our own Grumman F.4F Wildcats. The Zero was faster and could outclimb our Grummans, but the Grummans could take a lot more punishment than any of the Japanese planes. At the sound of an air raid siren, 3 or 4 of our Wildcats would come up off the fighter strip, and if they had enough advance warning, they'd climb as high as they could go. When the Japanese bombers approached, our guys would zoom down on them, often knocking a couple of them down like duck pins. Any time a smoking or partly crippled Japanese bomber fell out of formation, it was sure to be whacked by one of our guys who had been hanging out at a distance and waiting. The situation changed when the bombers were escorted by Zeros, or when the Zeros came overhead by themselves to harass our own ground position and the positions of other companies, diving and strafing us while we scrambled for cover. We Marines on the ground didn't take many casualties from the enemy planes, but they did keep us honest and humble.